In this lecture, I'm going to describe the organs of the female reproductive system, except the ovary, which I cover in another lecture. You are going to learn the histological structures associated with the uterine tube, the uterus, cervix, vagina, and the mammary gland. And I'm also going to stress the functions of each of these organs. When I describe all these features, I'd like you to understand firstly the structure and function of the uterine tube. I'd like you to understand all the phases of the menstrual cycle and the changes that occur in the uterus during the menstrual cycle. And I want you to recall that both the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle are regulated by hormones secreted by various tissues, both within the female reproductive system, the ovary and the uterus, and also from the pituitary gland. And then I want you to have a very clear understanding of the structure of the cervix and vagina, and also the lactating and non-lactating breast. I will also briefly describe the external genitalia in the female reproductive system. There are a number of very important functions carried out by all the organs that I'm going to talk about. The uterine tube is really specialised for transport of the sperm and the oocyte to create a possible location for fertilisation, where the environment is very nutritious as well. It's very important that the endometrium, the functional part of the uterus, goes through cyclical changes under the influence of the hormones estrogens and progesterone to prepare the endometrium for the possible implantation of a fertilised egg. The cervix acts as a very important transport conduit or passageway for sperm. And at the time of ovulation, that cervix changes the nature of its secretion to try and optimise the transport of sperm. Normally, around times other than ovulation, it's a very important barrier to the invasion of pathogens. And the vagina, as well as being the organ of copulation in the female, provides a very protective environment, because entry into the vagina of any bacteria or pathogens can find their way all the way up through the cervix to the uterus, through the uterine tube and beyond into the female body. And finally, the mammary gland is a very important gland. During lactation, it provides milk, nutritions to the suckling child. And I'm going to briefly describe that, and hopefully you'll understand the structure and function of this gland. We will start off first with looking at the uterine tube. Just to remind you of the structures associated with the female reproductive system, cast your eyes on this diagram here. Try to focus on, first of all, the orientation. At the base of the diagram is the bladder, the large round yellow structure in this diagram. And on the right-hand side of the bladder, or I should say on the posterior part of the bladder, is the vagina. And you can see the vagina is continuous with the cervix and then the uterus, a large pear-shaped organ. And then you can see the lumen coloured in bright red of the vagina and the cervix and also the uterus being continuous with the lumen of the uterine tube, which is going to be the topic of our first organ in this lecture. That uterine tube lies very close to the ovary. The ovary is coloured in blue here. Now, the anterior portion of the body is on the left-hand side. The posterior part of the body is on the right-hand side. And not shown in this slide, but right next to the vaginal passage will be the rectum. So make sure you can orientate yourself and make sure you're now aware of the location and continuity of each of the organs that we're going to discuss in this lecture. The uterine tube is shown here on the diagram. It's between 10-12 centimetres long. Focus on the diagram, and then I will talk more about the histological structures of the uterine tube on the histological sections also contained on this slide. The uterine tube is divided into 4 different components. They're named there, the infundibulum, which is the end part of the uterine tube, which has these very numerous branches of mucosa called fimbriae. The fimbria are actually extensions of mucosa, and they become almost like erectile tissue at the time of ovulation. And they're going to actually wrap around the ovary, or very close to the ovary, to optimize the chance that the ovulated oocyte will pass into the uterine tube. The next part of the uterine tube is the ampulla. This is by far the longest part of the uterine tube, and it is the site where fertilization occurs. And then there's a very small portion, the isthmus, which is very close to the entry into the uterus, and then a small interuterine component or segment, also labelled. So make sure you now understand that there are these 4 components to the uterine tube. And before we go any further, let us just recall that at ovulation, when the oocyte is released, it is still yet to complete its second meiotic division. It's been sitting in the ovary possibly for 50 years because, as you may know, these oocytes developed from oogonia prior to fetal life. And although there is a lot of atresia, at the time of birth you may have only 400 to 500,000 of these oogonia remaining in the ovary. And they sit there for a very, very, very long time during the reproductive life of the female, which can last until the age of about 47 to 55. So really, one of these oocytes that is ovulated may be 50 years old. And because of that, and because it's arrested in the second meiotic division, during that long time, there is the possibility of errors in the meiotic division process. And this can give rise to anomalies, such as non-disjunction, arising, for instance, in the trisomy of chromosome 21 or Down syndrome. So it's important to understand that there is this long arresting of the oocyte in the second meiotic division, and it's only after fertilization that meiosis is then completed. Well, what happens now is that the oocyte enters into the uterine tube. And on this slide, you can now see there are 3 sections through the uterine tube. The top left section is the uterine tube cut in very low magnification. And you can see various components in a higher magnification. The uterine tube has a very thick muscular wall. That muscular wall, or the muscularis, creates peristaltic contractile activity that can move fluid and contents such as sperm from the uterine end of the uterine tube up towards the ampulla where fertilization may occur. So it enhances movement of the sperm up to that region. Conversely, the peristaltic wave of this muscle can work in the opposite direction after fertilization and enhance the transport of the fertilized egg towards the uterus for implantation. At the higher magnification, you can see details of the mucosa. The mucosa is a very folded epithelial surface. Remember, the term mucosa refers to an epithelial surface and its supporting lamina propria in a tube that is exterior to the body, that opens exterior to the body. And if you think about the anatomy of the reproductive system I described earlier, this tube does eventually lead to the outside of the body. The epithelium has 2 sorts of cells. It has a ciliated cell. You can see the cilia here, and the little dark pink line running along the surface of these cells are the basal bodies in which these cilia are attached, and they all beat together to move fluid along and to move the oocyte along and also the sperm along so they meet each other for fertilization. Besides being an organ for transport and providing the location for fertilisation, it's also a very important tissue for making sure there is nutrition inside the lumen for the oocyte, the sperm, and also for the possibility of the fertilised egg. And they're called secretory cells or PEG cells. Now, before we move on to looking at the uterus, the uterine tube also undergoes changes during the cycle. At around the time of ovulation, these ciliated cells and the PEG cells are maximum in number, and they can be as much as 30 microns in height. And during periods of non-ovulatory phases of the ovarian cycle, such as the follicular phase and the luteal phase, these various cells can be reduced to half their height, and they can lose the cilia and become non-secretory. It's only after the influence of estrogen and progesterone that they reach their optimal state of activity at the time of ovulation. Estrogens actually create ciliogenesis in the ciliated cells, so they acquire cilia and more cilia at the time of ovulation, and progesterone stimulates the secretion of the PEG cells to produce the nutritious fluid that we spoke about earlier. I want to move on now to discuss the uterus. And again on this slide, this diagram shows you where the uterus is located. It's a relatively large organ associated with the female reproductive system. And it has two components that I'll now describe. The uterus undergoes drastic changes throughout the menstrual cycle. Let's just look at this slide, and on the top left-hand side there is a low magnification picture of the uterus, and then there is a closer up picture on the left bottom of the slide illustrating an example of the proliferative endometrium. The uterus has two components. It has a myometrium and an endometrium. And you can see on the far right-hand side slide a larger section showing the secretory endometrium. And I'm going to talk about these two phases of the menstrual cycle and pay particular attention to the changes that occur during the proliferative stage of the menstrual cycle and the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle. I mentioned earlier that the uterus has two parts to it. It has the endometrium, which you see here, and I've spoken about briefly. It also has a myometrium, a very thick muscular wall. And that myometrium consists of smooth muscle cells predominantly. And those smooth muscle cells are around 50 microns in length. And they're all joined together by gap junctions, and they all contract at the end of pregnancy to expel the fetus. But during pregnancy, those smooth muscle cells can grow drastically in size, mostly by hypertrophy. They can grow from 50 microns to about 500 microns. So there is this enormous growth of the myometrium, the muscle layer of the uterus, during pregnancy. The endometrium is the component of the uterus that changes with every menstrual cycle. I want to first describe the secretory phase, the secretory endometrium, because that is a better basis for then looking at the other stages. On the left-hand side, you can see the secretory endometrium labelled. This is the internal lining of the uterus. The external lining is the thick muscle layer you can see on the top left-hand slide. So we're going to describe the changes to do in the secretory endometrium. First of all, when you look at the section, it's got a very bluish stain to it. It's a very active tissue. All the cells there are highly active, doing various jobs that I'll describe as we go through this lecture. You can see some little wiggly white lines running through the section of the endometrium. These represent very coiled glandular tissue. This secretory endometrium is prepared for possible implantation of a fertilized egg. So it has to have a number of features. It must have glands that are very active, and that's represented by the coiled nature you see there. It must have many cells there that are providing secretion, particularly glycogen, to provide nutrition for the possibility of the implanting blastocyst. It also must be warm and moist, so there's a very large blood supply to the endometrium, even though you don't really see it that clearly in the histological sections because a lot of the capillaries collapse down. And this is the ideal environment to have to be the womb of the developing child, a nice, nutritious, warm environment for implantation of the fertilized egg. On the right-hand side, it shows diagrammatically the sorts of histological components that I want to emphasize. First of all, down the bottom of the slide is the myometrium. Besides being muscle, as I explained before, it also carries in it some large blood vessels, the branches of the uterine artery carrying blood to the endometrium, and that blood circulates into the endometrium and returns back to the system via the uterine vein. So that's the myometrium. Then look above and look at the endometrium. It's divided into two components. One is the functional layer and the other is the basal layer. And the basal layer is very important because that's the layer that remains after menstruation. And that is the layer that has the ability to then proliferate and repair all the lost endometrial surface. The component of the endometrium that's lost during menstruation is the functional layer that's illustrated here. Now just have a look at the endometrial glands, those long, yellow, shaded tubes that you see extending from the surface of the endometrium down into the basal layer. Well, under the influence of progesterone, those glands become secretory. They become very coiled, like you see in the histological section, and they accumulate glycogen. They become very, very secretory to provide nutrition, as I mentioned earlier, for the possibility of an implanting blastocyst. And those glands have got to that stage of being secretory because under the influence of estrogens, during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, has repaired the uterus, the endometrial component of the uterus that's shed during menstruation. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other feature I would like you to understand at this stage, looking at this particular diagram, is the arteries you see. You have a very basal straight artery, and you also have a spiral endometrial artery, an artery that coils its way to the surface of the endometrium and then gives rise to tiny little branches and supplies all the blood to all those cells and glands in the functional part of the endometrium that are so important. And as I said earlier, those capillaries then drain into a venous plexus and then drain out through the uterine vein. So they're the important components within the endometrium at the stage where ovulation has just occurred and the endometrium, as I explained, is now ready for the possibility of an implanting blastocyst. It's now grown from about 1 millimetre to 6 millimetres in thickness. So it grows very, very significantly under the influence of estrogens. And now, once that growth has occurred and that thickness of the endometrium has been achieved, then progesterone acts on the glands to become very secretory and the blood supply to be increased to that region. So they're the main structural and functional changes that occur during this secretory phase of the endometrium. And it's often called the progestational period because it's under the influence now of progesterone. Have a look now at a description and also some detailed evidence of what occurs during the proliferative phase of the cycle. On the left-hand side, again, you see a histological section through the endometrium just after menstruation. And you don't see a lot of the coil glands and the bluey stained characteristics of the endometrium you saw earlier. You do see the base of these coil glands in this section. What you're looking at here is the basal layer. It's shown on the diagram on the right-hand side. That basal layer, as I explained earlier, remains after menstruation. And what happens is that if you look at the diagram, you can see there is a division, a white line going through, meaning that the top part, the functional part, is lost during menstruation. And under the influence of estrogens, these glands to the left, the components left in the basal layer, can proliferate and grow up to the surface and repair, re-epithelialize the surface of the endometrium, again under the influences of estrogens. So that's why that basal layer is very important to repair all the glands, the surface of the endometrium, and also cells within the connective tissues. The lamina propria of the endometrium can then divide and the thickness can increase and grow, again, as I said before, under the influence of estrogens. The diagram illustrates what happens during menstruation, and I just want to briefly go through that. Remember, the spiral artery supplies the functional layer of the endometrium during the secretory phase of the endometrium. At the end of this secretory phase, when there has been no support or no indication, no implantation in the endometrium, then with support for this is withdrawn. Progesterone is withdrawn from the ovary, from the corpus luteum. LH is inhibited, so the corpus luteum shuts down, so progesterone shuts down, and the estrogens start to decline. That brings about a sudden change in that secretory endometrium that I described earlier. And what happens is that those spiral arteries undergo a spasmodic change in their supply of blood. 1 minute blood's flowing through them and then there's stoppage. And this occurs over a period of time until finally those coil arteries actually rupture. And then blood flows into the lamina propria, shown here, labelled 2. And the lamina propria then becomes engorged with blood, and then finally the tissue is shed from the surface, indicated by the number 3 there. So it's those spiral arteries, the spasmodic supply and withdrawal of blood through those arteries, and therefore the breakage of these arteries, and then the necrosis occurring, that is responsible for the shedding of that functional layer of the endometrium at menstruation. The basal layer remains because, as you can see, number 4 indicated there, that little straight basal artery remains supplying that area with blood. It doesn't go through the spasmodic changes that coiled or spiral artery undergoes. So blood is still continually supplied to that basal layer. It is important then that you can appreciate what occurs after menstruation under the influence of estrogens, that this endometrium is then repaired, and it's called the proliferative phase or estrogenic phase. And you can see on this slide that there is rising levels of estradiol, the most important estrogen. Progesterone is very low there. And this estrogen, remember, is coming from the ovary, coming from the follicles of the ovary during the follicular phase. As the follicle grows, they put out secrete more estrogens, and that's reflected in the blood and reflected in this profile here you see. And those rising estrogen levels are responsible for repairing that endometrium. On the right-hand side, you can see after ovulation, after the LH surge and the corpus luteum forms and secretes progesterone, progesterone rises. And that's responsible for, as I mentioned earlier, the secretory activity of the endometrium. You can see all the coil glands in this particular section. So it's called the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle. It's often called the progestational stage. And this little diagram, again, illustrates the changes that occur in the glands going through each of the stages. Number 1 there, the endometrial gland is lost. Part of it's lost during menstruation. And then number 2 there indicates that under the influence of estrogens, these glands repair themselves. A lot of mitotic activity going on to repair the glands and to repair the surface of the endometrium. And the gland grows, as you see in number 3 there, under the influence of estrogens. And then after ovulation, under the influence of progesterone, the glands become secretory and coiled, as you also see in this slide. And you have the development of the spiral arteries going up into the endometrium. I've labelled some little decidual-like cells in this diagram in the secretory phase of the endometrium. These cells appear at this stage under the influence of progesterone. And what they do is later on, should there be an implantation occurring, these decidual cells can then tend to wrap around the implanted blastocyst and provide nutrients to that blastocyst as it goes through its development. And then towards the end of pregnancy, it forms a layer between the placenta and the lining of the uterus, the endometrium. And that layer is a layer that makes the placenta separate easily away from the endometrium at the end of pregnancy. And here is a diagram to summarise those changes I've just described during the proliferative phase in the glands and also the secretory phase in the glands. And superimposed above are the profiles of the hormones to stress to you the importance of the function of estrogen and also progestin at various stages of this menstrual cycle. Now let's look at the cervix and the vagina. Shown on the diagram, you can see the cervix and the vagina. I want to just bring your attention to the label of the cervix there. You can see part of the cervix, which is really an extension, a component of the uterus, part of the cervix extends into the vaginal cavity or tube. The part of the cervix that is still adjacent to the lumen of the endometrium is called the endocervix. And the part that's protruding and the epithelium is exposed to the vaginal lumen is called the ectocervix. And they're two very important parts of the cervix at the junction of the vagina because the epithelium changes. Sections of the cervix are shown here in this slide. There are 3 histological sections indicated. On the top left-hand side is a low magnification of the cervix, and the epithelium on the far left side of that section turns around a loop and then enters into the vagina area. Down the bottom left-hand side, you can see identified cervical glands. These cervical glands are housed within the cervix mucosa. These glands secrete mucus, and the cervix, the mucosa of the cervix, doesn't undergo the cyclical changes as dramatically as the endometrium in the uterus. It doesn't have a spiral artery, so the mucosa is not shed from the cervix. But the mucus secretion does change. These glands get very active at the time of ovulation. They secrete 10 times the amount of mucus that they secrete at other times of the ovarian and also the menstrual cycle. And that mucus changes its nature. It becomes very, very watery. And that's conducive for the transport of sperm up through the cervix, into the uterus, and beyond into the uterine tube. At other times, the mucus is very viscous. It provides a barrier to both sperm transport as well as possible bacteria and other pathogens trying to make their way up into the uterus and beyond. On the top left-hand slide, I've labelled the transition zone. This is a zone where the mucosa, the epithelial lining of the cervix, which is columnar in nature, the epithelial cells are columnar, it changes as it comes to the junction with the epithelium of the vagina. It changes to be a stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous epithelium is the epithelium designed to reduce wear and tear, and that's required in the vagina as being the copulatory organ in the female. This transition zone can, at some stages, go through metaplasia. It can change its nature and give rise to cancerous cells. But luckily, the cells lining the cervix, the epithelial cells, exfoliate themselves. They're lost, in other words, from the surface, and they get exfoliated into the vagina. So a pap smear can sample these cells, and therefore you can detect, or the technologist, the pathologist, can detect whether any cancerous cells are amongst those exfoliated cells. The vagina is a muscular tube. It's supported by a lot of connective tissue to give it strength. It's lined by a stratified squamous epithelium. And that stratified squamous epithelium is very important for, as I mentioned earlier, being the wear and tear organ that it is. Have a look at the right-hand side and you can see the epithelial surface, stratified squamous. You can see the very base of the layer of the epithelium sitting on a fairly tough fibromuscular connective tissue. The very dark purple lines, cells you see there, are going to be cells dividing constantly to replace cells above them as these cells are lost or desquamated from the surface, which is a natural continual process in the vagina. Notice also that the surface cells, or at least cells as they move away from the basal level even, acquire this very pale or clear stained area. That's because these cells start to acquire lots of glycogen in their cytoplasm, and the glycogen's leaked out during processing, so you don't see it in sections. That glycogen is very important because it's secreted or it's desquamated into the lumen of the vagina when the cells are lost. And that glycogen is acted on by bacteria to produce lactic acid and other acid types to maintain the environment of the vagina acidic. And of course, that's a barrier to invading pathogens and bacteria. It's also a barrier to the sperm. So we'll learn in another lecture that seminal fluid is alkaline to try and neutralise that acidity and create an almost neutral environment to optimise sperm transport. I just want to briefly explain the external genitalia and the clitoris. The external genitalia consist of the labia majora. These are two longitudinal folds. They represent, or they're homologous to the scrotum in the male. And they contain smooth muscle that's homologous to the dartus muscle in the scrotum of the male. And they have essentially got hair on one surface and they're smooth, non-hairy on the other surface. The hair on the surface, like the scrotum, is pubic hair. And there are also sweat glands and also sebaceous glands on both surfaces. The labia minora are also two folds. They represent, or they're homologous to the skin of the penis. They're non-hairy, there's no hair on their surfaces, but they too also contain sweat glands and sebaceous glands. The clitoris is homologous to the male penis. It has two cylinders of erectile tissue called the corpora cavernosa. They're the erectile tissue in the clitoris. And also there is a glans clitoris, which contains, again, erectile tissue. It's not shown in this section, but it contains erectile tissue and has an enormous number of sensory nerve fibres. Notice that unlike the penis, the urethra is not in the erectile tissue. The mammary gland is a modified apocrine sweat gland. In fact, it really is a number of glands, individual apocrine sweat glands. You see two sections here of the non-lactating mammary gland. On the left-hand picture, it's taken at low magnification. And you can just make out some dense connective tissue, some adipose tissue, and then tiny little profiles of what are terminal ductules, small ducts that remain in the non-lactating breast. And these terminal ducts are shown at higher magnification on the right-hand side of the slide. These terminal ducts, under the influence of prolactin, progesterones and estrogens during pregnancy, are going to develop into the secretory units of the modified sweat gland, the apocrine sweat gland. They're going to proliferate and form lobules, acini, secretory units. And then within those secretory units, there's going to be an intralobular duct that then carries the secretion product towards the nipple, where it joins the lactiferous duct. And then the milk is then secreted from that lactiferous duct. And just prior to the exit of the duct in the nipple, there is a little structure and outpocketing called the lactiferous sinus. On this section now at low power, you start to see a number of lobules forming. These are individual modified apocrine sweat glands, each with their own duct system, each then opening in through the lactiferous ducts out into the nipple. And under high magnification on the right-hand side, you can see some details of each lobule. And all those secretory units evident there are really just growth of these terminal ducts that remain in the non-lactating breast that have gone through this growth and transformation into secretory units under the influence of various hormones. So, in summary, I think it's important to understand the importance of the uterine tube being both a transport organ for sperm and the oocyte, possibly to bring them together for fertilization, and also the epithelial cells provide nutrition to the environment for those oocytes and sperm and for the fertilized egg. Also, there is this muscular layer around the uterine tube that aids that transport, besides the ciliated epithelial cells. The endometrium undergoes drastic changes under the influence of estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen repairs the lost functional layer of the endometrium after menstruation, and progesterone then stimulates the repaired glandular tissue to start secreting glycogen and other nutrients that are important for the possible implantation of a fertilized egg or a blastocyst. And these changes are all designed to optimize that possibility. The cervix optimizes transport of the sperm because the secretory cells secrete a watery mucus at the time of ovulation, whereas at other times the mucus is very thick and viscous, and it is a retardation for transport of any bacteria and pathogens, and even sperm. And the vagina is a protective environment because of the acidity of the lumen produced by the action of bacteria on glycogen produced by the epithelial cells, and it has a wear and tear epithelium because it's a female copulatory organ. And lastly, the mammary gland is a modified sweat gland. It undergoes dramatic changes during pregnancy and also during lactation. So thank you for listening to this lecture. I hope you've now learnt a lot about the organs of the female reproductive system, and I hope you now can appreciate how important it is that all these organs act together in unison under the influence of hormones they produce, but also hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland.